Some men spend their entire lives trying to get invited to the table. Harrison Cole spent 40 years sitting at the far end of it, listening quietly while everyone else destroyed themselves. The chandelier above the dining room cast a warm golden glow across the old oak table, but there was nothing warm about the silence inside the Ashford estate that night. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the empty gardens, while crystal glasses clinked gently beneath Eleanor's trembling hands. Harrison sat in his usual seat near the end of the table, slightly removed from the others, wearing the same faded denim shirt and worn brown work jacket he always wore during family dinners. His silver hair looked uncombed, his rough hands folded calmly beside an untouched glass of wine. Across from him, Isabel looked flawless beneath the candlelight, her long blonde hair draped neatly over one shoulder as she poured wine into David's glass, without ever once acknowledging Harrison's existence. "Honestly, David," she said softly, though her voice carried through the massive dining room, "your father would be ashamed to see what this company has become." David loosened his dark tie and stared down at the financial papers beside his plate. Deep shadows rested beneath his eyes. "We're handling it," he muttered. Isabel smiled thinly. "Handling it? The banks disagree." Ethan sat halfway down the table near the staircase, pretending to scroll through his phone while quietly observing everyone in the room. He noticed something strange immediately. Nobody spoke to Harrison directly, yet nobody ever asked him to leave. Not even Victoria, who controlled nearly every conversation inside the estate, seemed comfortable looking at him for too long. At the opposite end of the table, Eleanor adjusted the sleeve of her pastel cardigan and kept her eyes fixed on her untouched soup. She looked nervous, almost frightened. James, the family's longtime butler, entered carrying another bottle of wine. But instead of serving Victoria first like always, he paused beside Harrison. "Would you prefer the Cabernet tonight, sir?" The room fell silent for half a second. Isabel's hand stopped moving. Ethan slowly looked up from his phone. Harrison gave a small nod without lifting his eyes. "Thank you, James." Victoria immediately cleared her throat. "Well," she said sharply, forcing a smile, "some people certainly get comfortable staying where they don't belong." Isabel let out a soft laugh. David said nothing. Harrison simply reached for his fork and continued eating as though nobody had spoken at all. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant hills. Then Ethan noticed something else. Above the fireplace, hanging beside the original portrait of the Ashford family founder, there was an old black and white photograph he had somehow never truly looked at before. And standing beside the founder himself, younger but unmistakable beneath the grainy shadows, was Harrison. Ethan waited until after midnight before going back downstairs. The Ashford estate always sounded different at night. During the day, the mansion carried the noise of expensive shoes against marble floors, distant conversations behind closed doors, and the constant pressure of people pretending to be important. But after midnight, the house settled into silence. Old pipes creaked softly behind the walls. Rainwater tapped against the giant windows overlooking the dark property. Somewhere upstairs, a grandfather clock marked each passing minute like a warning nobody wanted to hear. Ethan moved quietly through the hallway with his phone flashlight lowered near his side. He could not stop thinking about the photograph above the fireplace. He had lived inside the estate his entire life, yet somehow he had never noticed Harrison standing beside the Ashford founder before. Or maybe he had noticed and simply never questioned it. That was how things worked inside the mansion. People learned very early which questions were safe to ask and which ones made the room suddenly quiet. The library door was slightly open when Ethan reached the end of the corridor. Warm light spilled faintly across the hardwood floor. He slowed his steps. Inside, Harrison sat alone near the fireplace wearing reading glasses Ethan had never seen before. Several old leather-bound ledgers rested open across the desk. Beside him, James stood nearby holding a small silver tray with untouched coffee. "The Chicago property taxes have been handled," James said quietly, "and the attorney confirmed the documents arrived this morning." Harrison nodded once without looking up. "Good." Ethan froze in the hallway. The voice sounded different here. Calm, controlled, not like the quiet outsider everyone ignored during dinner. James noticed Ethan first, but showed no surprise at all. "You should not sneak through hallways in this house, Mr. Ethan," he said gently. Harrison finally lifted his eyes from the papers. For a moment, Nobody spoke. Ethan stepped slowly into the room. "I saw the photograph upstairs," he said carefully. Harrison removed his glasses and leaned back in the chair. The firelight reflected softly against the deep lines on his weathered face. "A lot of old photographs in this house," he replied. Ethan shook his head. "Not like that one." Silence filled the room again. Ethan glanced toward the ledgers spread across the desk. Financial records, property maps, documents carrying the Ashford name going back decades. "Why does everybody act like you are invisible?" Ethan finally asked. Harrison studied him for several seconds before answering. "Because it is easier for people to protect their lies when they stop looking directly at the truth." Upstairs, somewhere beyond the dark staircase, a door slammed hard enough to echo through the estate. Isabel's voice rose sharply in the distance, followed by David's exhausted reply. Harrison did not react. He simply closed the ledger in front of him and rested one rough hand against the worn leather cover. "This family built everything on appearances," he said quietly. "The trouble with appearances is that eventually they start collapsing under their own weight." Then Ethan noticed the name embossed in fading gold across the front of the oldest ledger resting beside Harrison's hand. Harrison Cole Ashford. The next morning, the Ashford estate looked beautiful in the way expensive places often do when they are quietly falling apart. Sunlight poured through the tall dining room windows and stretched across the polished oak tableware. Untouched breakfast plates sat growing cold beneath silver covers. Isabel stood near the coffee station in a cream-colored silk blouse, scrolling through numbers on her tablet, while David leaned heavily against the counter with both hands pressed against the marble surface. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. "We cannot keep delaying this," Isabel said without looking at him. "The board meeting is in 48 hours. David rubbed his eyes slowly. "I said I would handle it." Isabel let out a soft, impatient laugh. "Handle it with what exactly?" "We are bleeding almost $2 million a month." Ethan stepped quietly into the room just as the silence tightened between them. Neither noticed him at first. Isabel lowered her voice. "If we sell the Connecticut property and liquidate the vineyard shares, we buy enough time to survive the quarter." David shook his head immediately. "Grandfather would never allow that." "Your grandfather is dead," Isabel replied coldly. "And Harrison certainly does not make decisions here." Ethan felt something strange twist in his chest hearing her say the name out loud after what he had discovered the night before. Before he could speak, Eleanor entered slowly wearing the same pale cardigan from dinner. She looked tired, as though she had not slept at all. Isabel's expression changed instantly into practiced warmth. "Good morning, Eleanor. You should eat something." Eleanor barely acknowledged her. Instead, her eyes drifted toward the empty chair at the head of the table. Harrison's chair. Ethan noticed that detail immediately. Nobody else seemed to sit there anymore. Almost as if the family had silently accepted it belonged to him despite pretending otherwise. James entered carrying fresh coffee. "Mr. Harrison already left for the city," he announced calmly. Isabel frowned. "Left for what?" James adjusted the silver tray in his hands. "Meeting with Thomas Whitmore and the Ashford financial trustees." The room went still. David slowly lifted his head. "Trustees." James nodded politely. "That is what I said, sir." Isabel set her tablet down harder than intended. Why would Harrison be meeting with the trustees? Nobody answered her, not even James. Ethan watched something flicker across Eleanor's face then. Fear. Real fear. She lowered herself carefully into her chair and stared down at her folded hands. "It is starting," she whispered softly, almost to herself. David turned toward her. "What is starting?" Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment before answering. "The part your father spent 30 years trying to prevent." Upstairs, thunder rumbled faintly beyond the distant hills again, despite the clear morning sky. Ethan looked toward the empty chair at the head of the table and realized something terrifying for the first time. Harrison had never been sitting at the end of the family. He had been sitting quietly above all of them. By late afternoon, the mansion felt colder than usual despite the fireplaces burning throughout the estate. Ethan stood near the second-floor balcony overlooking the grand foyer while voices drifted upward from below. Isabel had spent most of the day making phone calls behind closed doors, and every conversation seemed to end the same way. Frustration. Silence. Another glass of wine poured too quickly. David had locked himself inside his office after returning from downtown, and nobody had seen him for hours. Only James moved calmly through the estate, as though none of the tension touched him at all. Ethan watched him cross the foyer carrying a stack of folders toward the west wing, where the private study remained closed most days. "James," Ethan called quietly. The older man stopped immediately. "Yes, Mr. Ethan?" Ethan hesitated before speaking. "How long has Harrison lived here?" James looked almost amused by the question. "Longer than anyone currently under this roof." "That is not an answer. It is the only one I am allowed to give." Ethan leaned against the railing. Everybody acts afraid of saying the wrong thing around him. James adjusted his cuff carefully. "That is because they already have." Before Ethan could ask another question, the front doors opened downstairs. Harrison stepped inside, carrying rain across the shoulders of his faded work jacket, even though the storm had barely started. Outside, Thomas Whitmore entered behind him holding a leather briefcase, while Sophia Bennett followed several steps later, balancing two thick binders against her chest. Ethan immediately noticed the change in atmosphere. James straightened slightly. Eleanor rose slowly from the sitting room. Even Victoria stopped speaking mid-sentence when Harrison walked through the foyer. Nobody greeted him. Nobody questioned where he had been. Harrison removed his gloves calmly and handed them to James. "The documents are finalized," he said quietly. Thomas gave a short nod. "Everything is legally secured." Isabel appeared at the top of the staircase almost instantly, her expression perfectly composed despite the tension beneath it. "What documents?" she asked. Sophia glanced briefly toward Harrison before answering. "Estate restructuring paperwork." Isabel descended the staircase slowly in her heels, each step echoing through the foyer. "I was not informed of any restructuring." Thomas closed his briefcase. "You were not required to be." The silence afterward felt sharp enough to crack glass. David finally emerged from his office looking pale and exhausted. "What is going on?" he asked. Nobody answered immediately. Harrison simply looked toward the massive portrait hanging above the fireplace. The original Ashford founder stared down over the room with the same cold expression Ethan had begun noticing in the old photographs upstairs. Harrison spoke without turning around. "Your grandfather understood something very few wealthy men ever do." His voice remained calm. "Steady. Money does not destroy families." Isabel folded her arms tightly. "Then what does?" Harrison finally looked at her. "Entitlement." Somewhere outside, thunder rolled across the property again. Ethan noticed Eleanor quietly wiping tears from beneath her eyes, while James lowered his gaze toward the floor. And for the first time since discovering the truth, Ethan realized this was never simply about inheritance. It was about a family that had spent decades pretending the wrong man held all the power. That evening, the rain finally arrived hard enough to rattle the windows of the Ashford estate. The entire mansion seemed wrapped in the sound of the storm, while lightning flickered faintly across the distant hills beyond the property. Dinner had been moved earlier than usual at Harrison's request, though nobody openly questioned why. The long oak table looked almost ceremonial beneath the chandelier light. Crystal glasses reflected pale gold against polished silverware, while thick shadows gathered in the corners of the massive dining room. Ethan noticed immediately that the seating arrangement had changed. Harrison's chair no longer sat near the far end of the table. It waited quietly at the head beneath the portrait of the Ashford founder himself. Isabel stopped walking the moment she saw it. "Absolutely not," she said sharply. James calmly pulled the chair back anyway. Harrison entered a few seconds later wearing the same weathered denim shirt beneath a dark wool coat still damp from the storm outside. He did not ask permission. He simply took his seat while Thomas Whitmore placed a thick envelope beside his plate. Nobody touched their food. David looked trapped somewhere between confusion and exhaustion, while Victoria sat unnaturally still beside Eleanor, her fingers wrapped tightly around her wine glass. Sophia remained near the fireplace reviewing documents silently. Ethan watched Isabel carefully. For the first time since he had known her, she looked uncertain. "This has gone far enough," she finally said. "Whatever performance this is supposed to be, David needs to stop it now." David did not answer. Harrison folded his hands calmly on the table. "Sit down, Isabel." The room became perfectly still. Even the storm outside seemed quieter for a moment. Isabel stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me." Harrison never raised his voice. "You have spent years speaking inside this house as though authority belonged to you. Tonight you will listen instead." Ethan noticed Eleanor close her eyes slowly, as if she had feared this moment for decades. Thomas adjusted his glasses and opened the envelope beside Harrison. As acting counsel for the Ashford estate, he began carefully, "I am required to formally acknowledge the activation of succession clause." 14. Victoria suddenly stood up, so quickly her chair scraped harshly against the floor. "No," she whispered. Thomas continued anyway. Under the original trust agreement signed in 1987 by Charles Ashford, all controlling authority over Ashford Holdings, estate properties, and financial assets immediately transfers upon activation to Harrison Cole Ashford. David looked physically sick. "What does that mean?" Sophia finally spoke from beside the fireplace. "It means your family spent 30 years believing the wrong man was dependent on them." Isabel turned toward David in panic. "Say something." But David could not take his eyes off Harrison. Neither could Ethan. Harrison reached calmly for the envelope Thomas had placed beside him earlier and slid a single document across the table toward Isabel. She looked down at the page. Her face lost all color almost instantly. Quietly, Harrison spoke the words that finally shattered the illusion holding the entire family together. "You tried to sell a house that was never yours." The silence after Harrison's words felt heavier than the storm outside. Isabel continued staring at the document in front of her as though reading it again might somehow change what it said. Her perfectly controlled expression had finally cracked. Ethan could see it clearly now in the way her fingers tightened against the edge of the paper. "This is impossible," she whispered. Thomas Whitmore calmly removed another folder from his briefcase. "Actually, it is extremely precise." He opened the file carefully beneath the chandelier light, while rain hammered against the tall dining room windows. The estate was never transferred to David Ashford directly. Control remained under a protected family structure created by Charles Ashford after the financial collapse in 1987. David looked stunned. "My grandfather never told me any of this." Eleanor finally lifted her eyes from the table. "Because your grandfather did not trust weakness around money," she said softly. Her voice trembled slightly. "And he saw too much weakness in this family." Victoria's face hardened instantly. "Charles trusted me." Harrison looked toward her calmly. "No, he tolerated you." Nobody moved after that. Even Isabel seemed too shocked to speak. Ethan watched James quietly refill Harrison's water glass before stepping back into the shadows near the fireplace again. The gesture looked natural, practiced, like something he had done for decades. Sophia walked slowly around the table, placing copies of legal documents beside each family member. "These are the finalized records," she explained. "Mr. Harrison Cole Ashford has remained majority owner of the estate holdings, trust structures, and controlling voting shares for over 30 years." David stared down at the paperwork. "Majority owner?" Sophia nodded once. "Your grandfather protected the company under Harrison's authority because he believed the family would eventually destroy itself, fighting over appearances instead of responsibility." Isabel suddenly pushed back her chair. "This is ridiculous. Harrison was fixing fences and repairing boilers 6 months ago." Harrison folded his hands quietly. "And your point?" Isabel looked around the room, desperately searching for support that no longer existed. "You all allowed this man to pretend he was some kind of servant." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears again. "No," she whispered. "We allowed ourselves to pretend he was not the one holding everything together." Ethan felt the truth settling over the room piece by piece now. Every strange silence. Every moment nobody challenged Harrison. Every time James treated him with quiet respect, while the others looked past him completely. Harrison had never needed recognition because the power already belonged to him. David slowly leaned back in his chair like a man realizing the floor beneath him was no longer solid. "Why stay?" he finally asked. "If all of this was yours, why stay here letting everyone treat you like that?" Harrison looked toward the storm-dark windows for several seconds before answering. "Because your grandfather made one mistake." His voice remained calm. He believed blood automatically created loyalty. Lightning flashed outside bright enough to illuminate the entire dining room for half a second. Harrison's weathered face appeared older in that sudden light. "Tired. Disappointed. I stayed because somebody had to protect what this family inherited before people like Isabel convinced you all it existed only to be consumed." Then he reached for the final folder beside his plate and slid it directly toward David. "Unfortunately," Harrison said quietly, Your wife already signed documents that changed everything." David stared at the folder in front of him for several long seconds without touching it. The rain outside continued beating against the windows of the Ashford estate, while the chandelier above the dining table swayed almost imperceptibly with the distant thunder. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Finally, David opened the folder with trembling hands. Ethan watched his father's expression slowly collapse line by line as he read the documents inside. "No," David whispered under his breath. Isabel immediately stepped closer to him. "David, whatever that says, they are manipulating you." Harrison remained perfectly still at the head of the table. "Read the signatures carefully." David turned another page. His face lost what little color remained. "These are sale authorizations," he said quietly. "Transfer agreements. Loans against the estate." Sophia nodded once from beside the fireplace. "Signed 6 months ago." David looked up slowly toward Isabel. "You told me these were temporary restructuring documents." Isabel folded her arms tightly. "Because that was the plan until this ridiculous situation changed everything." Thomas Whitmore adjusted his glasses. "The situation did not change, Mrs. Ashford. You simply never understood who controlled the assets you were trying to leverage." Isabel's composure finally cracked completely. "I was trying to save this family." Eleanor let out a soft, bitter laugh from further down the table. It sounded old, exhausted. "No, Isabel," she whispered. "You were trying to own it." Ethan saw something shift in David then. Not anger. Something worse. Humiliation. The realization that his entire life had been built around believing he was the future of the Ashford Empire, while quietly depending on a man he barely acknowledged during dinner. Harrison looked toward David calmly. "Your grandfather gave you opportunities. He gave you education, position, access, but ownership was different." David's voice turned hollow. "Because he did not trust me. Because he understood you too easily needed approval from people like her." Harrison's eyes moved briefly toward Isabel. Silence swallowed the room again. Victoria suddenly stood from her chair and walked toward the fireplace with slow, measured steps. "Charles was always paranoid," she said coldly. "He enjoyed controlling people through secrets." Harrison finally looked directly at her. "And yet you stayed here 30 years benefiting from those secrets." Victoria turned sharply toward him. "I earned my place in this family." Harrison's expression never changed. "No, you survived it." Ethan noticed James quietly closing the heavy dining room doors behind him then. The sound echoed through the estate like the locking of something permanent. Isabel looked around the room desperately now. "You cannot seriously be allowing this man to take everything." Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair. "I am not taking anything." His voice remained low and controlled. "I am simply refusing to let any of you destroy what was entrusted to me." David lowered his head into his hands while the storm outside deepened across the hills surrounding the mansion. Then Sophia stepped forward holding one final document against her chest. "There is one more matter requiring immediate attention tonight," she said carefully. Ethan looked toward her. Something in her expression made his stomach tighten instantly. Sophia opened the folder slowly and looked directly at Isabel. "It concerns the attempted liquidation of the estate that was arranged through Lily Carter." Sophia placed the final folder carefully at the center of the table while the storm continued raging beyond the windows of the estate. Nobody reached for it. Isabel stood perfectly still near David's chair, though Ethan could see panic building behind her carefully controlled expression now. Harrison remained seated beneath the chandelier with both hands folded calmly in front of him like a man who had already accepted the outcome long before anyone else entered the room. Sophia opened the folder slowly. 3 months ago, she began. Mrs. Isabel Ashford authorized preliminary negotiations involving the private sale of the Connecticut estate, the vineyard shares, and portions of the family trust through an outside intermediary. David looked up sharply. "What intermediary?" Sophia turned one page. "Lily Carter." The room shifted instantly. Ethan felt it. Even Eleanor lifted her head in disbelief. Victoria narrowed her eyes toward Isabel, while Thomas Whitmore quietly removed his glasses. Isabel laughed once under her breath, but there was no confidence left in it. Lily was helping organize potential investors. "No," Sophia replied calmly. "She was helping hide the transactions." Before Isabel could answer, the dining room doors opened again. Lily stepped hesitantly into the room wearing a rain-soaked coat. her face pale beneath damp strands of blonde hair. Ethan had never seen her look frightened before. James closed the doors quietly behind her. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Lily looked directly toward Harrison first. "I did not know," she said softly. "I swear I did not know the properties were protected under your authority." Isabel's voice turned sharp instantly. "Do not start acting innocent now." Lily flinched slightly, but continued anyway. "You told me David already approved everything." David slowly stood from his chair. "You used my name?" Isabel turned toward him in disbelief. "I was trying to save this family from collapsing." Harrison finally spoke again. "No, Isabel. You were preparing for the collapse." Silence followed. Heavy. Permanent. Ethan watched David carefully then. The exhaustion in his face had changed into something colder now. Clearer. Years of pressure, manipulation, and dependency seemed to settle over him all at once. "How much?" he asked quietly. Sophia answered without hesitation. If the transfers had completed successfully, over 70% of the estate assets would have moved outside family control within 18 months. Eleanor covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Victoria slowly lowered herself back into her chair. Without another word. Even she looked shaken now. Harrison reached for his water glass calmly while thunder rolled across the hills surrounding the estate. "Your grandfather feared greed less than weakness," he said quietly to David. "Greedy people are predictable. Weak people hand everything away trying to keep the wrong person beside them." David stared at Isabel for a very long time. Then, without anger or raised voices, he stepped aside from her completely. The movement itself felt louder than the storm outside. Isabel looked around the table searching for support one final time, but nobody met her eyes anymore. Nobody except Harrison. And somehow that seemed to frighten her most of all. Harrison nodded once toward James. "Prepare the guest house for Miss Carter tonight," he said calmly. Then his eyes returned to Isabel. "As for you," he continued softly, "you will no longer be staying inside this house after tomorrow morning." The storm had passed by morning, leaving the Ashford estate wrapped in an uneasy silence that felt stranger than the shouting and tension from the night before. Sunlight spilled through the towering dining room windows, touching the long oak table where breakfast had already been prepared by James with the same quiet precision he had maintained for decades. But the room felt different now, lighter somehow, honest. Ethan entered first and stopped almost immediately. Harrison was already seated at the head of the table beneath the portrait of Charles Ashford, wearing faded denim and pouring black coffee into a plain white mug while reading financial reports beside his plate. Nothing about him looked wealthy. Nothing looked triumphant. And somehow that made the power surrounding him feel even larger. Eleanor sat nearby wrapped in her pastel cardigan with a softness in her expression Ethan had not seen in years. The dark circles beneath her eyes remained, but the fear seemed gone now. Thomas Whitmore reviewed documents quietly near the fireplace, while Sophia stood beside the windows speaking softly with James about meetings scheduled for later that afternoon. The mansion no longer revolved around panic. It revolved around decisions. Real ones. David entered last. He looked exhausted, older somehow, but calmer than he had the night before. He paused when he saw Harrison sitting beneath the founder's portrait. Then slowly, without a single word, he took the empty seat halfway down the table instead of trying to sit near the head. Ethan noticed the choice immediately. Harrison did too, though he said nothing. For several moments, only the sound of silverware and distant birds outside filled the room. Finally, David looked up. "Isabel left early this morning," he said quietly. Harrison nodded once. That was wise. David stared down at his coffee cup. "I spent years believing I was protecting this family." Harrison folded the newspaper beside him. "No, you spent years trying to protect the version of yourself other people applauded." The words landed softly, but Ethan could see how deeply they cut. Eleanor reached across the table and placed one trembling hand over David's wrist. "Your grandfather feared pride more than failure," she whispered. "Pride blinds people to who is quietly carrying them." Ethan looked around the dining room then. The chandelier, the portraits, the massive windows overlooking generations of inherited land. For the first time in his life, the estate no longer felt like a monument to wealth. It felt like a warning. Harrison slowly pushed a thick folder across the table toward Ethan. "You should start reviewing the quarterly reports," he said calmly. Ethan blinked in surprise. "Why me?" Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair while morning light settled across the deep lines in his weathered face. Because you were the first person in this house who finally started asking the right questions. Silence settled over the room again, though this time it no longer felt heavy. Outside, the clouds had completely broken apart above the hills surrounding the estate. Harrison lifted his coffee quietly while the old mansion stood still around him at last. They had spent decades treating him like a man who repaired broken things inside the house. None of them ever realized he had been the foundation beneath it the entire time.